Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. It's Danny Dhaiphong, your host for another live stream. And as you can see, I'm joined by a very special roundtable. We have Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mercouris of the Duran and Brian Berletic of the New Atlas. How are you gentlemen all doing today?
Very well. Very delighted to be here.
Likewise.
Doing great.
So we have a lot to discuss. Make sure that you're hitting that like button to boost the stream and the YouTube algorithm. Hello, Rockfin family, Rumble family. Please do follow me on those platforms. And of course, support in any way you can in the links in the video description. The channels for both the Duran and the New Atlas are tagged in the video title if you are new to those. But let's get started. How about we do first, we begin with what's happening on the battlefield. Perhaps, Brian, how about you start us off? Where have things been going? There hasn't been much talk about what's been going on the battlefield, but I know you did a recent video that talks about the significance of what the mainstream Western media is saying about where this counteroffensive has gone. So how about we begin with you?
Thanks again for having me on. And I would just like to say that the offensive is now at 4 full months of fighting. Around October 4th will be 4 full months of fighting. And there is no noticeable gains by Ukraine. They keep claiming that these villages along the line of contact that they have taken, this is somehow progress. But in reality, it is not. The Western media itself has reported since last year that Russia built layered defenses, which are specifically designed to give ground to particularly strong or numerous assaults by Ukraine. And then there are these counterattacks by Russia to retake lost territory. And that is how it's been going for 4 full months. The losses on the Ukrainian side are catastrophic. The losses on Russia's side, even according to Western sources, are nearing an all-time low for the special military operation. I was just listening, actually, right before we went live, I was listening to Alexander's video, most recent video, and he was talking about this buildup on the other side of the Dnieper River in Kherson and some possible amphibious assault across the river. And I believe that this is an attempt to divert Russia's attention for one last full push along one of these main axes that Ukraine has been pushing. And again, the gaining of territory is entirely superficial. This is a war of attrition. So the more Ukraine trades away for territory, the closer to defeat it actually is. And you look at these articles, I was just looking at one from Lowy Institute, which is actually a US government and Australian government funded think tank in Australia. It says Ukraine counteroffensive makes gains, but dark clouds loom in Washington. And they're trying to sell these strikes on empty buildings in Crimea, these superficial gains along the line of contact as some sort of success and momentum building up. This is what we've heard for weeks. And that what has that momentum manifested into? Nothing.
I have nothing to add to that of any substance at all. I would simply say also this: if you look at the Russian Ministry of Defense's figures, and I'm not vouching for their accuracy. I'm not saying that their figures are absolutely correct, because I don't know. There's no independent way of corroborating them. But what they do seem to suggest is that over the last week or so, there has been a major tail off in the fighting. We're seeing far fewer people. The Russians are claiming that they've killed or wounded far fewer people on the Ukrainian side than has been true, was true just a few weeks ago. And that basically corresponds with, I think, the point that Brian was making. They haven't made any breakthroughs. There's this tantalizing discussion about this build-up on the west bank of the Dnieper. If that wasn't happening, though, and remember, the units that we're talking about that are supposed to carry out this amphibious landing are units that have already been heavily engaged in the fighting. They've been very, very depleted already. They're not fresh or combat-ready units, or at least I wouldn't have thought so, not by this point. But if one puts that aside, I really do get the sense that I'm not saying the offensive has ended entirely, but it is running out. I mean, it is just ticking along now. It's more that they're continuing with it in order to in order to avoid having to make the straightforward admission that the situation is, as Brian said, that they haven't broken through, they haven't taken any one of their major objectives, and up to this point, the offensive has failed.
I don't have much more to add other than it's a failure of an offensive. We're 4 months in. It's failed, but don't call it a failure. Call it a long war.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted, I know, Brian, you reacted to this article. I don't know if you all have read it, pardon for it. This is how it turns up when you get the New York Times on the free archival website. But the New York Times wrote this article not too long ago, the end of September. Who's gaining ground in Ukraine this year? No one. And I want to just scroll down here from January of this year. This is what the New York Times is saying in terms of what gains have been made. 143 square miles for Ukraine. And then here you have 331 square miles for Russia, but the net of 188. So even amid this, we're talking about the whole year, not even just this 4 months counteroffensive. Although if you count the amount of time that the West was talking about the counteroffensive, perhaps it's close to a year. But even the New York Times is now admitting that Russia has net gained territory in 2023, even if it is tiny. They also acknowledge in the article that this is Russia's objectives and aims. And so I'm wondering who would want to start reacting to that. Brian, maybe we'll go back to you.
Yes, it goes back to the West's obsession with this idea that territorial gains equals winning, and it doesn't. And we've actually seen this dual narrative developing in the Western media, where now they're admitting that this is a war of attrition, as Alex said, a long war. It's not going to be centered on who's gaining more territory, but who can outlast who. And we've begun hearing Western political and military leaders claiming that this is going to be determined by economics and military industrial output, which I'm not sure if they have a full grasp on the disadvantage they have, a disadvantage they cannot resolve in time. So this New York Times article, then they compare the net gain that Russia has made during Ukraine's offensive. Essentially, they're comparing it to, it's only as big as New York City, it's only as big as whatever else the example was. But at the end of the day, Russia never said they were going on the offensive. So the fact that they're gaining more territory than Ukraine, despite not even being on the offensive, what does that tell you about the state of Ukraine's military, the West's ability to support it, and their admitted goal of very ambitious territorial gains, which have not materialized? They're trying to downplay these Russian gains, but in reality, that they made any gains at all is really illuminating regarding the true reality of Ukraine's prospects.
Again, I agree with that completely. If you go back to the start of the year, nobody was talking then about Russian gains. I mean, it was all about the offensive that Ukraine was going to launch. And we're now 4 months into that offensive, and it has failed to make any important gains. Capturing a few villages is not what all those tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and machines and all that training and all those tens of billions of dollars was supposed to be about. It was supposed to be something completely different. And of course, again, at the start of the year, no one was talking about a long war. I mean, this is now suddenly something everybody is talking about. And when Brian talks about the fact that this is a war of attrition, and you've got to look at it in industrial, military industrial, and also human terms. And of course, that is absolutely correct. And that is what wars of attrition are all about. But the human losses, again, the evidence shows very strongly, are predominantly on the Ukrainian side. And of course, they have less ability to absorb human losses because they have a smaller population. Putting it in that way sounds very callous. But if you're talking about a war of attrition, that is the reality of it. And what is even more callous is to seek a long war, given the extent of the human losses that Ukraine is now suffering, is experiencing. Just shortly before we joined this program, Brian and I were having an exchange about an incredible article that the former British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, has written for the Daily Telegraph, in which he's slipped out the fact that the average age of Ukrainian soldiers now on the front line, he was careful to say it, on the battlefields, is now over 40. He didn't explain why. I mean, he sort of gave the impression that it was because President Zelensky is not calling up young people, which anybody who's been following the facts of the war knows is simply not the case. The reason we're talking about an army of middle-aged men is because the younger men are dead or wounded or missing or traumatized or in captivity or whatever. That is the reality of this war. And keeping it going, prolonging it in the way people are talking about, is going to add to that disaster and is going to make it far worse.
Yeah. I mean, this is such a grift. It really is. It's such a tragedy. It's such a grift. It's such a catastrophe for Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, and even the Ukrainian soldiers that are fighting, the Russian soldiers, but the Ukrainian soldiers, because while they're going on and on about territory, the Zelensky regime is talking about territory, and we're going to gain Rabotinyu and liberate that and take over that and get to Crimea. You know, the collective West leadership, especially in the U.S., maybe they'll mention territorial gains every now and then, but I've got the impression that they don't even care that much about the territorial gains. This is all about deterring China now. It's all about deterring China. And someone needs to wake Ukraine the F up, because the United States is openly telling them, like openly, all the leadership of the U.S. are telling them, you go fight Russia, you degrade Russia, so that we can send a message to China. Just keep on fighting, keep on losing men. Ben Wallace is talking about mobilizing teenagers, kids, youth.
Yeah.
Let's mobilize the youth.
Yeah.
Why? So that they can fight Russia, so that they can send a message then to China and prevent some sort of invasion of Taiwan. When did China say they're going to invade Taiwan? When have they said that? Never. But that's what this is all about now. All of this is about deterring China. Beat Russia to deter China. And it's a great deal for the American people. It's a great deal. 3% of our military spend to destroy 50% of the Russian army. If you destroyed 50% of the Russian army, how come NATO just doesn't march into Moscow? Just go in there. What are you waiting for? And if you destroyed 50% of Russia's army, I imagine China must be really shaking now. Geez, NATO's destroyed 50% of Russia's army. Ukraine has done it. Wow. We better not touch Taiwan. This is a tragedy. And they're talking about 20 billion and 24 billion. And Lindsey Graham was talking about 70 billion. Me and Alexander recorded a video just before we did this live. And then Lindsey Graham is going off about now giving them 60, 70 billion. It's a tragedy, man. It's such a tragedy. I don't know. I don't know why this information, these statements from the U.S. officials, from people like Graham and Biden, all these guys, is not reaching the people of Ukraine so they can wake up.
Yeah, we're certainly going to get to all of the tragic farces and fantasies that have been bandied about of late amongst the political class. But back to your point, Alex, about this long war, this contradiction between this long war and also this idea that Russia's military has been defeat cut in half, so to speak. I'm wondering if we could talk about, Brian, you made a point in your last video about the possibility of a sort of a West Ukraine buffer zone. And I'm wondering if you all could comment on whether this is the strategy now in regards to this long war, because Alexander, you said this idea of a long war was not being discussed prior to this year, that it was all about pushing forward, full Ukrainian victory. And now suddenly we're talking about a war of attrition on the Ukraine side, which seems to me what Russia has been saying all this time in terms of how they would like to fight in order to achieve their objectives, as well as to ensure they reduce casualties, keep the economy stable, etc. So maybe, Brian, if we could go back to you about, is this the strategy now, a buffer zone to try to freeze things? What's your take?
I think this is an option that they have been seriously considering. They've already done it in Syria. And this seems to be a natural reaction that they have to a proxy war that is failing. If the proxy war is failing and we have the ability to physically take territory within this country, create a safe haven for our proxies where this nation that we're targeting cannot reach them, cannot destroy them, then we can, at a minimum, freeze the conflict, if not turn the conflict around. This was their thinking in Syria. They created these safe havens, Turkey in northern Syria. The United States invaded and still occupies everything east of the Euphrates River. The problem with that, however, was, yes, they created a safe haven. Syrian forces with Russian and Iranian backing, they could not strike, at least not directly, these forces in these areas. Although I think more recently we've seen kind of a shift. But those forces were never able to reconstitute themselves. They were never able to return in force and threaten the gains that the Syrian government made with the help of its allies. And beyond that, the patience that Syria, Russia, and Iran have demonstrated in Syria has allowed the ongoing process of multipolarism, its emergence and the fading away of the US-led unipolar world order. And that has begun changing the region, and it's undermined the US position in the Middle East in general, and it has specifically undermined the US position in eastern Syria. So we have watched that change. We watched Saudi Arabia pivot away from the United States, repair its relations with Iran. Syria has repaired its relations with the rest of the Arab world. And when you see these developments continue, even during the special military operation and after Russia supposedly lost half of its military power, as I remember Alex saying many times in his videos, does Russian President Vladimir Putin just have everyone fooled? Does he have Saudi Arabia and Turkey fooled? Able to convince them that somehow they're winning when in reality they're on the verge of collapse. And I think it's quite the opposite. They can see how things are actually developing, not just in Syria, but in Ukraine and everywhere else. So getting back to the buffer zone in Ukraine, if you understand the buffer zone in Syria, doing it in Ukraine would be a way of temporarily freezing the conflict, de facto freezing the conflict. The fighting would continue outside of the buffer zone, but they calculate possibly that Russia wouldn't dare strike within it. But I think Russia has sent very strong signals to the contrary, saying that probably they would. And we've seen them backtrack on this, but I think it's an idea they're still considering. They keep talking about these factories they want to build. The only way they could do that, they want to send the British military in to train Ukrainians. The only way to do that is if they created a buffer zone and guaranteed Russian forces couldn't strike these facilities once they pop up.
Mm-hmm. I think this is absolutely right. I think this is the plan. I think the idea is try and get some kind of a ceasefire together. And, you know, they assume that they can get the Russians to agree to a ceasefire. Get a ceasefire, flood Western Ukraine with Western troops, create a sort of buffer zone, safe haven type zone there, and rebuild a Ukrainian military, install factories and war factories and all those kind of things, and then at some point you're going to renew the war. That's I think the plan. Problem is the Russians have said we've already figured it out. If you read, and I have been reading very carefully over the last week or so, a whole succession of statements made by Russian officials, most particularly Lavrov, who has given the most detailed statements. That's exactly what he said they want to do. And he said, why should we therefore agree to a ceasefire? We are not going to agree to a ceasefire. We are not going to allow them to do this thing. And at the same time, another Russian official, Medvedev, when the British were floating this idea of sending troops in, he came forward and said, look, if they go into Syria, their targets were coming after them. So I think the British were trying to fly a kite. I think they wanted to see how the Russians would react to that proposal. I think they were wanting to see how the British public would react to that proposal. And I can tell you straight away, negatively. I mean, I've not seen any polling data, but the British government is always keeping track of what British opinion is thinking. And I think they were also looking to see whether any other European allies especially would come forward and say, what a great idea this is. We're prepared to do the same thing. And of course, on that, there's been absolute radio silence. So in light of this, and with all these strong words coming out of Moscow, the Prime Minister backed down. I mean, he called the whole thing off, even though actually, if you look at the original words used by Grant Shapps, he wasn't talking about the end of the war. I mean, this is a ex post facto rationalization by the British of what he was saying. But anyway, they backed down. But that doesn't mean that in different circumstances and in a change of scenario, this isn't going to be revived again. Especially as, if I can just talk about Britain briefly, there is every sign that there is a huge row now going on between people like Sunak, who say, well, hold on a moment, you know, if nobody supports us, if the population isn't happy, if the Russians are saying that they're going to respond, if the Europeans are silent, let's not go forward. And the real hardliners, people like Admiral Radakin, Ben Wallace, people like that, who are absolutely furious. They don't want things to stop or pause in any way. And that's why we're getting all these angry interviews with Radakin, which Brian has taken apart brilliantly, if I may say. And also this astonishing article by Ben Wallace. There is a debate going on in Britain. And we can see that the hardliners are there. They've not given up, and they're going to come back. So it's entirely possible this idea could be revived.
Yeah, you know, you run into these people. I think everyone has run into these people that think they can con you all the time.
Yeah,
I mean, we all know who these people are, and they always try to one up you. They always try to con you. They always try to get one past you. And I think that's what we're dealing with when we're looking at a lot of these people in the US and the UK. They're thinking of it like this: we conned Russia for Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. We got them. We told them that Minsk is going to fix the issues with Ukraine. We'll put pressure on Poroshenko at the time. We'll then put pressure on Zelensky. We'll follow the Minsk Accords. But we weren't going to do any of that. We were just buying time. So we fooled them, and they're all sitting around at a table and they're laughing. They say we fooled them. While Putin was thinking that we're going to enforce the Minsk agreements, we had other plans in mind. We were building fortifications. We were arming the Ukraine military. We were digging trenches. We were doing all these things to prepare for what would be an eventual conflict with Russia. And that's what they're thinking now. That's why they're all sitting at the table and they're all saying, you know, if we just tell Russia, let's have a ceasefire, we just give Russia a couple of concessions. We don't have to follow the concessions. We don't have to agree to anything. we'll tell Russia, we'll move missiles a little bit back. We'll tell Zelensky to do this and to do that. They'll believe it. And then we can create a buffer zone, or we can build factories to manufacture weapons, or we could rearm the Ukraine military. Hell, we can send UK and Polish soldiers into the west of Ukraine. Don't worry, the Russians, they'll believe it. We got them with Minsk 1, we got them with Minsk 2, we'll get them again. They're just thinking that they can pull another fast one, another con job against Russia, but they're upset. They're angry because Russia's figured it out. That's what always happens when someone tries to con you and you figure out what they're trying to do. They always get upset with you. And they start calling you the bad person. You're the idiot. You're the a-hole. You're the one. They lash out at you. That's what we're seeing. That's why you have Ben Wallace. That's why you have Lindsey Graham. They're all upset. They're all upset because Russia figured it out.
Well, perhaps now we can get to speaking of lashing out, there's a whole lot of lashing out on the political front in relation to what you all discuss, frequently about where this conflict is right now. Maybe we can start with the head honcho, Commander-in-Chief of the United States, Joe Biden. Recently, there was the whole spending row, will there be a government shutdown? They averted the shutdown with a initial agreed upon spending plan, but it excluded Ukraine aid, which angered Joe Biden. And he literally said, there's not much time to do this. Unclear always what Joe Biden is thinking when he says these kind of things, but he seemed a little desperate, especially in the tone and just the brevity of his language. But then Joseph Borrell said, well, if the United States is going to have trouble sending aid, well, we'll just do it. So there was this open divide with regard to this. And we'll get to Lindsey Graham as well. But perhaps before we get to Graham, your reactions to this, what the United States, I mean, this is the champion of this conflict. This is the principal provocateur. What exactly is going on here? This seems to be a pretty damning shift in political enthusiasm and just outright support for Ukraine at this moment. And I don't know, whoever wants to begin, maybe we can begin with Brian since.
Yeah, so looking at U.S. internal domestic politics and how they're dealing with this, it's very hard to tell what exactly they're really thinking, because there's a lot of theater that takes place. The Republicans want to appear as if they're opposed to President Joe Biden, so they have to obviously be opposed to his war, exactly in the same way the Democrats and Barack Obama were with Bush's wars, before doubling down on all of them and then starting all of the wars Bush wanted to start but wasn't able to during his presidency. So that I don't think that there's any genuine opposition. I mean, there surely are people in Congress who genuinely oppose this war, but many of the people who claim they do don't really oppose it. It's all politics. It's all theater. I believe they'll get the money together eventually. The problem, and as I've said, Alex and Alexander have said, the problem isn't money. They can always just print off more money. The problem is weapons. They are out of weapons. They are out of ammunition. They do not have the ability to expand production to make the weapons that they need for this conflict. All at the same time, they are looking at China, preparing to irreversibly surpass the U.S. in all regards, not just the U.S., but the collective ones, the G7 even. And they're trying to balance their desire to eliminate Russia as a near peer competitor, and also prevent the rise of China. I believe they cannot do either. They're still determined to do both. And so this is a debate that they're surely having behind closed doors. It will manifest itself publicly in Congress, and I think it's very hard to make any sense of it. The people who say let's go after China, it's not as if they don't want to wage war with Russia. They want to, if they could, they would wage war against everyone. But now they're forced to pick and choose. And then in reality, when you think about it, they cannot even stop Russia in Ukraine. How are they going to stop China within its own territory? Taiwan is technically Chinese territory right off their coast, across an entire ocean. How are they going to do that? So it is a big mess, but that's what happens when you try to perpetuate unsustainable foreign policy.
I completely agree. Alex and I have done a program about this, and let me express my own views about this business in Congress. I think what a lot of people perhaps haven't fully understood is that this is a procedural battle. It is not about funding for Ukraine. Was about whether funding for Ukraine ultimately would be attached to budgetary appropriations for all sorts of other matters. Now, there is a faction within the Republican Party which is deeply opposed to that. And it seems to me that both the administration and the Republican leadership in Congress instead decided to go down this path of trying to keep these two things together, keep the funding for Ukraine as part of this overall package, because they didn't want to highlight the fact that there are some Republicans, increasing numbers of Republicans, who are angry about this and don't want to continue to support funding. And the hope was that it would, in that way, all be waved through. Now what's going to happen instead is that the administration is going to present a Ukraine funding bill. There is a substantial majority of people in Congress, in both the House and even more in the Senate, who continue to support funding for Ukraine. And that bill will pass. That's the thing people need to understand. It will pass. The administration will get its funding. In fact, they've so confident that it's going to get its funding that they've already just cancelled that. You remember they were going to go for Lend-Lease, that there was going to be a Lend-Lease system. That's all be dropped because they're going to pay for it directly instead through these appropriations. Now, the reason they wanted to conceal the fact that there is this division, this divide within the Republican Party, is twofold. One, the sort of McConnell, Lindsey Graham, McCarthy faction doesn't want to highlight the fact that there is a split within the Republican Party, because that would show that they are gradually losing control of the party. And the administration doesn't want the issue of funding for Ukraine to become a debating issue, an issue that people talk about and debate in the forthcoming election. So this is an attempt to sweep the thing under the carpet rather than a concern about getting money for Ukraine. Now, the thing to also understand is that within the faction that opposed this appropriation, that is going to vote against funding for Ukraine, this is not a monolithic group. There are some people, like, for example, Rand Paul, who are straightforwardly opposed to funding for Ukraine. They are genuine non-interventionists. But there is another significant faction, people like Josh Hawley, for example, who are straightforwardly saying, look, we're wasting our money and our energies focusing on Ukraine. Our real adversary is China. We're depleting our military. So let's conserve our military, the better to go after China. So this isn't, in any conceivable sense, either a vote for peace. That isn't the debate that's happening in Washington at the moment. And it's not a vote against funding for Ukraine. Congress will vote through those funds. And even if it didn't, even if something happens which surprises me, they will still find that money, because in Washington, money is always found. That is the iron rule of American politics.
Yeah, they're gonna get the money. There's no doubt about that. They're gonna probably get 60 billion. Yeah. Like Graham said, they're going to get a lot more than 24 billion, 60 billion over the next year. What they liked to do over the past 15 years, not over the past year and a half, over the past 15 years, ever since Maidan and even before Maidan, the coup in Maidan, is that they liked to hide the money that was going to Ukraine.
Yeah.
They would combine it with other bills. They'd hide it underneath other bills and resolutions, and no one had any clue how much money was going to Ukraine. We still don't really have any idea how much money has gone to Ukraine. None of the stuff is audited. No one knows. I've heard 100 billion, I've heard 80 billion, I've heard 113 billion, I've heard 150 billion. No one has any clue, which means that it's probably 2 to 3 times more than any of the numbers they're putting out there. So the money's going to get to Ukraine. The problem that the entire political class has, except for the politicians that are running anti-political establishment, I'm thinking Trump and RFK Jr. The problem that the rest of the entire political class has in the United States is that when they start to create bills like what Alexander says, bills for Ukraine, a specific bill which says we're going to give 10, 20, 30, 50 billion for Ukraine. This is the Zelensky, we're giving you money to buy homes bill. When they create bills like that, then the American people, they get furious, they get angry, especially with everything that happened in Maui and in Ohio and all these other things that happened, and the people of the United States saw no money. What's going on at the border right now? The people of the U.S., they start to see that, hey, they just gave another 10 billion to Ukraine. They gave another 20 billion. And people are getting angry. This is what they don't like. And they're trying to avoid that because we're in an election cycle right now. And I don't think either party, Biden or the Republicans, want to highlight how much money is specifically going to Ukraine.
Yeah, and speaking of having no idea how much money is going to Ukraine, we often don't know how much money is going to the Pentagon. Tens of trillions of dollars completely lost in audits, absolutely nowhere to be found. So it is quite reasonable to believe that Ukraine has received many more billions than what has been stated, and we just don't actually know where it went. Perhaps it didn't go there at all. And then the point that you made, Alex, about politics and the elections, I mean, you add Cornel West and RFK Jr. into this independent mix, and you have a pretty big political crisis on all sides of the spectrum, potentially pulling votes away from Biden. It is trouble for the neocons. And I wanted to play, I know, Alex, you played this video in your recent publication on your channel of Lindsey Graham, because we're back to as you guys stated earlier, the China, the Ukraine is all about China talk. And that's a great picture. That's a great freeze on Graham, by the way. But let's listen to what he has to say on Face the Nation, because I think this is really important. And I'd like your reactions to it, given that we are at a point where there will be money going. The U.S. can print money, can print it. It doesn't really matter. But there is kind of an ire of almost desperation here when questioned, and the media is questioning more about Ukraine aid maybe than at any point in the past. So here we go.
Have you asked Donald Trump, your friend, to come out and publicly support more aid to Ukraine and to push some of these skeptical members of the Republican conference?
I'll leave it up to him to what to do, but he wanted to get out of Afghanistan.
Well, Vladimir Putin has been praising him for his comments about Russia and Ukraine.
Here's what I'll say about President Trump. He did not pull the plug on Afghanistan, even though he wanted to. The biggest mistake we made since the war on terror is withdrawing from Afghanistan. To President Trump and anybody else, if we pull the plug on Ukraine, that's 10 times worse than Afghanistan. There goes Taiwan. To stop funding Ukraine is a death sentence for Taiwan. Putin will keep going. You missed all of World War II if you don't know how this movie ends. To the Republicans who say Ukraine doesn't matter to us, you're wrong. Respectfully, you're wrong. The war gets bigger, not smaller. There goes Taiwan. If Ukraine can beat Russia, China's less likely to invade Taiwan, and Putin gets stopped.
Have you asked?
So there you go. I mean, this is how Lindsey Graham is thinking about things, and it feels like a far cry from how we've been talking about Ukraine aid for a while now in terms of the neocons. They've been talking more about Ukraine aid as victory against Russia, with some on the edges talking about China, but now this comes up again from Lindsey Graham. Your reactions, maybe back to you, Brian.
He's completely delusional. He is absolutely detached from reality. He's talking about if we leave Ukraine, what kind of message is that going to send to China? Well, what if you stay in Ukraine and you invest everything? You exhaust your military. You invest in a buffer zone, for example. A point that I made in my last video is that they would need to commit the collective West's air power in implementing that and creating a credible deterrent to Russia from escalating or responding. And if you did that, you would have nothing left to fight your war that you're trying to provoke with China over there in the Pacific. So actually, it's a lot worse for the United States if they continue this. Inevitably, they could lie to themselves. I was looking at Ben Wallace's article. He claims Russia has lost 2,500 tanks, 6,500 armored vehicles, 300,000 dead and injured, and these are numbers that are very similar to what the Ukrainian general staff claim. These numbers are, again, detached from reality. You're lying to yourself. That is not the reality. There's no logical explanation as to how these numbers could actually even be. So he's making this argument because he's starting from a very flawed premise where he thinks that the United States is entitled to being the global hegemon. It has the right and the obligation, even maybe in his mind, to tell people from the Americas all the way to Eurasia how to mind their affairs, how to run their business, how to use their resources, what types of governments they'll administer their countries with. But it is a flawed premise, and everything they build on top of it is equally flawed. And this is where we see him making these delusional statements. It's not, let's think about this. It is not going to deter China, even if they were somehow able to stop Russia. It's not going to deter China. China is much larger. Its military much larger. Its industrial base much larger. And the situation between it and the island province of Taiwan is entirely different. The dynamics are entirely different. What makes him think that China would just simply back down? What makes him think that?
Well, indeed. I mean, the thing about Lindsey Graham's comments is that if you follow the logic that he's trying to pose upon you, there is no moment when you would ever say we've reached the point where we've done all we can do and we can't do more. I mean, always, if you're going to look about deterring other people, if you're stopping the next Second World War or whatever it is, then you have to go on giving and giving and giving everything and just go on doing it. Whatever happens on the battlefields, whatever happens in the existing military situation. Now, of course, Lindsey Graham was in Kiev a few days before the offensive started. He was shown the plans. He came away very happy. He said, this is going to work. This is going to be a tremendous, brilliant success. Well, it hasn't been. We're 4 months from that point, and Ukraine is stuck. But his response is, we don't step back. We don't rethink what we've done. We don't ask ourselves whether, we're on the right course. We just go on investing and reinvesting in this bottomless well, because if we don't, we have all these mirages that we're frightened of, that's going to encourage the Russians here or encourage Putin there or encourage the Chinese. It's a way of not actually looking at the problem. And of course, we could talk about the United States, but it is the Ukrainians who are paying the price, the ultimate price for all of this. So it is incredibly dangerous what he's doing, and it is incredibly wrong. And it demonstrates why, in my opinion, a person like Lindsey Graham should never, ever be in any sort of position where he can make decisions, because he is not making decisions in a rational way.
I just want to one quick thing I forgot to mention. Lindsey Graham did this exact same routine regarding the proxy war in Syria. And we saw how that went. Not only did they fail, but now the US is getting evicted from its military occupation in eastern Syria. And this is because they're spread too thin. Now they're committed to Ukraine. They're committing themselves to Taiwan. So they're setting themselves up for failure. So again, what kind of message does that really send to the rest of the world?
Yeah, but this is his argument to give more money to Ukraine, to keep the war going. This is how they're arguing it now. It's all about China. And so they're going to the American people and they're saying, look, fighting in Ukraine is good because it's going to prevent China from invading Taiwan. So that's why you have to give more money and more weapons to Ukraine. That's how they're connecting things. This is the new domino theory, right? This is how they're rationalizing this. Because when you think about it, over the past 3 months, the whole narrative around Zelensky and Ukraine has been shattered. It's not about human rights. There is no democracy. Zelensky isn't a heroic figure. Ukraine does have NAZIs. I mean, it's all been shattered. And they're not gaining territory. They're not gaining any territory. You know, they were supposed to be in Crimea by now. Zelensky and Budanov said they're going to be swimming in Crimea over the summer. They're not even 100 miles closer to Crimea. They're still in the gray zone. They're still in the security zone. So they've come up with this new script, which is this is all about China now.
Yeah.
I don't know who's going to buy it. I mean, who's buying this stuff? That's my question. Who's actually believing this?
I'm afraid a lot of people will.
Yeah, but they're selling it. Yeah,
I mean, there are going to be a lot of people who will. I should just quickly say, by the way, on as a military strategy, it also sucks. It's about the only thing I know about military things. But Frederick the Great famously once said that he who defends everything defends nothing. If you're going to stop, holding your positions in Afghanistan and eastern Syria and in Ukraine, and you're thinking that that's going to protect you in Taiwan. Well, it's not going to protect you in Taiwan because all your forces are dispersed in all sorts of places around the world, and there is a finite point beyond which your resources don't go. And that, by the way, is a very, very characteristic problem of the neocons. They never accept, they never recognize that there is actually a finite limit to America's resources, that it just doesn't have the resources to go beyond that limit.
And by the way, the military that the United States has created to defend all of these holdings they have around the globe is a military incapable of fighting the type of intense, protracted, large-scale conflict unfolding in Ukraine. That is their primary problem. For the last several decades, they created a military to do these small wars and these occupations all around the globe. Now they don't have the military or the military-industrial base to fight a large-scale war, one that they themselves have provoked, and now they're trying to provoke an even larger one with China.
Yeah, and speaking of this, I don't know if you all saw this report, but Brian, and I think all of you have made points to this, but on Business Insider, recently there was this, I think, a really interesting read about how the counteroffensive is raising doubts about whether U.S. and Western militaries are training their troops for the right kind of war. And this kind of gets into what all of you have been saying. And that gets me to the question, if now the Westminster mainstream media is talking more about how even NATO itself would not fight a war like this in Ukraine if it were to put itself in Ukraine's shoes. I think that goes against the fact that Ukraine is literally being pushed and funded and armed to do this kind of war. But in any event, there seems to be this walking back. But if this is the case, then what does, if the United States is at the head of NATO, and we're talking about the United States, the EU, the NATO countries, minus a few in NATO, are all wondering about their capabilities with Ukraine, then what is the future of this conflict and also just of NATO in general. If they truly can't fight this kind of war, then how can they even expect to do anything whatsoever with regard to Russia and China? Because to me, it seems like politically, this and militarily, neither is really feasible. But maybe your reactions to that, whoever wants to jump in.
The military aspect, again, even these small wars the United States was fighting around the globe, they had this initial success in Iraq back in the 1990s, and then again in the early 2000s. They had this initial success because there was this disparity technologically between their military and the rest of the world's. But even in Iraq, we watched that shed. And then in 2006, the Israeli war with Lebanon, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, they carried out this massive air campaign. They were running out of bombs. They needed the U.S. to send emergency provisions to them. And then they sent ground troops in, and they were turned back by Hezbollah because already at that point, these irregular forces were getting their hands on military technology that put them on par with a force, say, like Israel or like the United States. So this is why the U.S. found itself in these quagmires in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Syria. And in a very similar way, that was the problem in Vietnam. Even though the U.S. had this massive military machine, people might not realize this. They lost over 10,000 aircraft because Vietnam was getting, at that time, modern air defense technology. So this is the problem the U.S. has. Their small wars don't work anymore, and they don't even have the capability of fighting a large-scale war, which, as all of us have talked about many, many times, requires a massive industrial base, which the U.S. and Europe don't have. And since the beginning of the special military operation, because they put their sanctions on Russia and they've denied Europe access to cheap energy, it's going to be even harder to create that industrial base that they need. Meanwhile, Russia and China have this massive head start, and that the title of the article was something like, the U.S. isn't training their forces for the right war yet. They're not training their forces, they're not equipping their forces, and their military industrial base is not prepared for the right conditions to sustain and win in modern combat these days.
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely correct. And can I just say, I mean, this isn't new. This is something that has happened before. It happened to the British Empire. The British Empire in the 19th century, its armed forces atrophied because they weren't fighting against peer opponents. They were fighting the equivalent of local wars. They were fighting local wars every year, continuously. The idea that the British Empire was a peaceful, quiet empire, completely wrong. But eventually, the British military became reconfigured for this. The Royal Navy gradually lost its edge. The British Army absolutely lost its edge. And then when the First World War began, they found themselves very short and they had to change things very, very fast. And they were lucky that they had strong allies and could find the time and the space to do that. So this isn't a new problem. It is what empire, one of the things empire does to you. If you have militaries that are there to act as a kind of power projection type force to maintain your control in all sorts of places, as against a military that is there to defend your country, then your military will evolve in a particular direction. I don't think the United States has any solution to this problem. The British began to understand before the First World War that there were problems with their militaries, and there were lots of attempts at reform and changes in the military. And to be said straightforwardly, the British political and military leadership of that era were far more capable and intelligent and forceful people than the United States, than you find in the United States today. There is no American equivalent to people like Kitchener and Fisher, for example, that you had in Britain at that time. So what I think is going to happen is the Americans are going to say to themselves, well, this is a war against a peer competitor. It's an industrial war. There's going to be an awful lot of talk, great deal of discussion. Lots of articles are going to be written about the training being wrong, about the need to build up the industrial base and all that. And nothing will happen because there are far too many people who want to leave things as they are. And besides, changing the configuration of the US Armed Forces would put in question the whole operation of the US Armed Forces up to this point. You have an army, a military that is focused on fighting peer competitors and defending your homeland and your home base. Then, of course, you're no longer going to have an imperial military anymore, which is really configured to go around and, you know, chase people in mountains in Afghanistan or occupy places in eastern Syria or do those sort of things. So I don't personally think there's going to be any sign of reform. It's the same with everything else that happens in the United States. An awful lot of money is going to be thrown at this problem, but there's not going to be very much coming out the other end.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They're going to throw more money at it. They're going to take the same solution that they use with the EU. They're just going to transfer it over to NATO, which is more EU. They're going to say more NATO. They're going to try to grow NATO. They're going to throw more money at NATO. They're going to tell countries to raise their percentage budget that goes into NATO. They got Finland. They're going to push to get Sweden. They're going to look to get Moldova, and they're just going to try to expand NATO, throw more money at NATO, increase the budgets of NATO. That's going to be their answer to whatever problems they're having. That's the way they always go about solving these types of situations. Instead of taking the advice of what Brian is saying and just pausing, stop, maybe even scale back and rethink things. No way. They can't admit that they're losing. They can't admit that they've been defeated. They can't admit that maybe things have changed and we have to kind of, look at things in a different way. The world is changing. They can't do it. They are just going to pour more and more money into this. If this was a business, this business is about to go bust. If this was being run in a smart way, if this was a business that was being run in a smart way and they saw competitors and they saw that the market had changed, that business would take a pause. It would stop. It would take a look at what's going around, take a look at its staffing, take a look at its management, take a look at its products and reconfigure. That's not what they're going to do. They're just going to print more money. They're going to force more countries, all the countries in Europe, which don't have the money, don't have the budgets, they're going to force them to pay more into the NATO pot. And the whole thing is just going to go belly up. When is it going to go belly up? 5, 10, 20 years? I don't know, but that's where it's heading.
Well, perhaps now we can pivot to some World War II revisionism, which I feel like is a huge theme over the last several weeks. There was, of course, the just multitudinous embarrassment in Canadian Parliament, the literal honoring of the NAZI, Mr. Yaroslav Hunka, which is probably the international scandal of the year, and if not, Canada's history. But then you also had even smaller examples of this. So recently you had Antony Blinken take to Twitter, where he often gets what they call ratioed, for those who don't know, just immense amounts of replies and quote tweets as in contrast to those who actually like what he's saying. But he said on Twitter 82 years ago, Nazis murdered 34,000 Jews at Babin Yar. Soviets buried this history, which today Putin's government manipulates to cover for Russia's abuses. Now, people on Twitter were not very happy. You had Dmitry Polanski, the UN permanent representative for Russia, respond. But the overall objection to this was, well, the massacres that occurred at Babin Yar were done by, yes, Germany's Nazi forces and their Ukrainian collaborators. This is located, of course, in what is present-day Kiev, and that many people were killed, not just the 34,000 Jews, but also you had 150,000 total people during this occupation, many of which were Soviet prisoners of war, communists, Romanis. We can go on and on and on. But the point is then you had, even in that short video that we played here of Lindsey Graham talking about World War II, he said, this is World War II. Did you watch it, World War II? Because we know where this is going. But yet, I'm just wondering your reactions to in your commentary on all of this, because first, I haven't heard World War II in a while be referenced in relation to this conflict, but it seems at this stage there's more and more bluster about it, and it really is blowing back in the face. But I think it needs to be talked about because it's really important and really dangerous the way that the United States and its Western allies, and I'll get into what Baerbock said at the EU foreign ministers meeting too, but maybe your initial reactions to this before we get to that.
I don't want to get your channel demonetized, so I will refer to them as World War II era Germany. The West has had a huge problem even before World War II. Their relationship with that German government, and then even at the end of World War II, I think it was the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill who was even contemplating siding with Germany against the Soviet Union. They said, well, look, we defeated Germany. Let's just have them pivot back against the Soviet Union and we will work with them. And at that time, there were people who said, no, we're not going to do that. But then all of the nations in the collective West grabbed up all of the German scientists, politicians, military leaders that they didn't put on trial. And they put them in charge of spearheading an anti-Soviet project that would continue to operate throughout the Cold War and even up to and including today. So the problems that we see, the extremists we see running around Ukraine today, they have a direct lineage all the way back to World War II, and then this post-World War II Cold War project that the West, including the US and also Canada and the UK, that they were running to use these extremists against the Soviet Union. And then after that, Russia. We saw the same thing with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They used them against various nations they targeted, not just in North Africa and the Middle East, but also China. They were using these groups to target China and countries in Asia. So they've always had a huge problem. Even in the U.S. military, I was in the U.S. military. There were far too many people who had an unhealthy obsession or admiration for World War II era Germany. And I was just showing people on my channel, there's this documentary on TV in the US, and General McMaster was about the Battle of 73 Easting during the Persian Gulf War in the early 1990s. And he was talking about how they defeated the Iraqis, and they had this Iraqi officer, and they put him in the back of the Bradley. And he said, hey, why do you have a picture of this, your enemy from World War II? It was General Rommel, a picture of General Rommel in a U.S. Bradley in Iraq. And he said, well, maybe if you studied him, you wouldn't be sitting in the back of my Bradley. And he said, we modeled ourselves after him. So they just think about how big of a problem this has been all throughout since the end of World War II. And remember, they did not beat the Iraqis in 1991 or 1991. They did not beat them because they were master tacticians. They beat them because Iraqis had no night vision. They had old rusty tanks, and they weren't trained properly, and they were getting blown up before they could even get into their tanks. It wasn't because they were outmaneuvering the Iraqis. So this has always been a problem. Maybe Alexander and Alex can elaborate even deeper into all this.
I think one of the fundamental problems that a lot of people of a certain political viewpoint have in the West about the Second World War is that, of course, the country that made the biggest contribution to the Allied victory in the Second World War was Russia, or at any rate, the Soviet Union. And this is a very embarrassing and very difficult fact. I mean, it is also, by the way, a fact that if you're talking about the places where the Holocaust took place, those places where the Holocaust took place were liberated by the Soviet army. They ended, in effect, what was going on in these places. In fact, they did end. It did end what was going on in these places. Now, this is very difficult, given that they are the adversary today, and it's become even more difficult given the politics of Ukraine. And again, we're going to have to be careful what we say, but I think we all understand what I mean. So the result is that you're having all these extraordinary, elaborate historical contortions. Now, what Blinken was referring to with Babi Yar is a controversy that actually existed within the Soviet Union itself, because the Soviets most definitely did commemorate what happened at Babi Yar, this massacre there. But following Soviet policies of that period, they didn't differentiate nationalities. And that didn't make it clear that most of the people who were killed in Babi Yar were Jews. Now, this was criticized at that time within the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet poet Yevtushenko wrote a poem about it, which Shostakovich, the composer, actually incorporated in his 13th symphony, of which, by the way, there is a Soviet recording. So this was a discussion that took place in the Soviet Union at that time. But of course, they did acknowledge what actually happened at Babi Yar. Blinken's attempt to try to change the story, to make it seem as if it was suppressed, is, well, I mean, it's mendacious. It is playing with facts. And this is what we're seeing all the time about the Second World War. So there's a huge effort to write the Soviets out of any account of what happened in the war in Europe. There is an equally strenuous effort to write the Chinese out of what happened in the war in the Pacific. Very few people actually know much about the fact that for most of the Second World War, the bulk of the Japanese army was fighting China. It wasn't fighting the United States at all. And at the same time, we have to trot out all these historical parallels, all these bad historical parallels from the Second World War in ways that make it look like we are still waging the Second World War against all these terrible people in Beijing and Moscow and wherever. We make all these false analogies. But in order to make those analogies stick, we have to go back and change the account of what actually happened. So I think it's very sinister in every respect. It's one of the most sinister things that has happened, given that the Second World War is still the single greatest and most tragic event of modern history. To actually start tampering with the history of that period, to try to sort of, misrepresent it in this way in order to advance current political points, that is straight out of Orwell, and it is straight out of 1984, and in ways that I once would never have imagined.
Yeah, rewrite the history of World War II, erase the fact that Russia played the most significant role in defeating Nazi Germany. You got to erase that. You then got to make Russia into the villain. They were the villain of World War II. Thus, they're the villain today. That's what they're saying. And take a look at when this rewriting of history began. This is not a coincidence. This is deliberate. And every one of the collective West leaders, the ones that are very much invested in Project Ukraine, they've been told that they need to incorporate some World War II revision in their speeches, in their interviews. Boris Johnson 2 weeks ago, he kicked it off. He said that Britain won World War II with the help of Ukraine. The next day, Ursula gives a speech to the Atlantic Council, her fellow, globalist warmongers. So she's speaking to the crowd, right? And she says that she doesn't mention what the U.S. did in Hiroshima. That didn't happen. But a bomb was dropped. And oh, by the way, Russia, we got to prevent Russia from doing it again. Nuclear threats. We can't let it happen again. Implying, she didn't come out directly and say it was Russia that dropped the bomb in Hiroshima, but everyone understood her connection, what she was trying to say. And then comes Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau, well, he got the memo about this rewriting of World War II. And Trudeau said, I'm going to top all of these guys. They're talking about Hiroshima. Boris Johnson is giving an interview in the UK media. I'm going to bring a real life living NAZI. And I'm going to bring it to Parliament and everyone's going to clap. And that's exactly what happened. And this guy has been to Parliament before. He's been honored before. Everyone knew who this guy was. He had a meeting with Zelensky and Trudeau a couple of hours before the event even kicked off. We all know this. And so you had what happened in Canada. A couple of days later, Blinken tweets out this, what you just read, Danny, about Babin Yar. He tweets it out. Everyone is asking, what is this guy doing? What is he talking about? People are saying, but he tweeted it out. I haven't seen him retract it. I haven't seen him delete that tweet. I haven't seen him say I messed up. Nope. He just goes on about his day. And yesterday, Ben Wallace, in the interview with The Telegraph, what does he say? He says that Ukraine needs to mobilize its youth just like Britain did in 1939 and 1941, just like Britain did in World War II. So I think you're going to be hearing a lot more of the collective West leaders trying to make this connection between World War II, Project Ukraine, but Russia was the villain then, and Russia is the villain today. So give Ukraine more money.
Yeah, and World War II was a long war. I mean, it lasted, at least for the West, it really didn't start with the interventions of 1941 when the United States and others started, especially the United States, started sending troops to actually do some fighting. But it was being fought by the Soviets. And you mentioned the Chinese. For many years before that, it was a very long war. And Alexander, to your point about the Chinese and what they had to experience during that war, I mean, it was... some say the estimates are closer to the Soviet figures and their losses than they are to what the West lost. 10 plus million people at least died at the hands of Japanese massacres and occupation. So, the revisionism is just on high, and it feels like it's a way to propagate this myth, of course, that the war is a lot less complex, a lot of revisionism, a lot of outright lies to say that, the United States and the West is involved in this huge war for democracy against these bad guys, Putin being the equivalent of, Mussolini, Hitler, or those guys. But at the same time, you have even more like subtle, I think, references that to me are even a little scarier because although Baerbock doesn't, it seems like every time I talk to you, Alex and Alexander, Baerbock is saying something very strange and just wild and off the cuff, very, very on brand for her. But this also, while it's not a direct reference to World War II, so to speak, when Baerbock says things like this, that the EU is going to stretch from Lisbon to Lugansk, it does give a very sort of World War II-esque expansionist vibe. Here she said at the EU foreign ministers meeting that Ukraine's future lies in the European Union, our community of freedom. It will soon stretch from Lisbon to Lugansk. Ukraine, as long as Ukraine also broadens its path to the EU with every village, every meter that it liberates, and every meter where it saves its people. So to me, I mean, these comments are very disturbing, not just because they're just completely contradictory to reality, but also the message that they send in terms of the EU's, the neocons, NATO's thinking and mentality through what I think is the attack dog, one of the many attack dogs in Europe, Baerbock. But whoever wants to react to this first.
Well, if I can start again, I mean, first of all, it is profoundly ignorant, and I mean, it shows a complete failure to understand either the battlefield realities or today's geopolitical realities. But if we're talking about Russia, then of course, for a German foreign minister to talk in that way about Europe being expanded to these territories is particularly unwise, given that, as Russians, of course, have never forgotten, the whole point about the German war against the Soviet Union, well, it had many causes, but one of them, one of the leading ones, was to gain what was called living space in the East, in these precise areas, expanding the territory of Germany and of German Europe, because, of course, the Germans were claiming that they were embodying the European values of that period, all the way to these precise territories. So to a Russian, this is going to sound like a really ominous echo of that kind of language from before. So it's something that I don't think, obviously, Baerbock intended, and I'm sure she doesn't really understand that history at all. But it shows once again how completely uninterested she is in Russian feelings and Russian opinions, but also something else, because she talks about a Europe extending to Lugansk, which is her, in effect, saying that Russia is not Europe. Now, the Russians have, I think, come to understand that there is a current of feeling in Germany and in Europe that thinks that and has always thought that. But given that since Peter the Great's time, and arguably actually even before, the whole direction of Russia was towards getting accepted as a proper part of Europe, this must also come across as a massive slamming of the door.
Actually, I was just going to say exactly that. It sounds exactly like Adolf Hitler's "We need breathing room. We need more space." And it's hard to believe that you have German politicians who aren't familiar with that. I mean, I cannot rule it out that she is ignorant and does not know this, because I think there's a lot of that going on. But it's so hard to tell whether they are just this ignorant, which is scary, or they're doing it on purpose, which is also scary. And I even see in the comment section, people are trying to say that General Rommel, he was a great general. I mean, he lost. He lost battles, and he was on the side that lost the war. He was not a great general. I don't think that he was a great general. I think he's overrated, and I think this is part of the problem the collective West has with trying to rehabilitate or romanticize Germany during that period. There is no romanticizing it. There is nothing redeeming about it. We have to look at that. If he was such a great guy, he should have realized who he was fighting for, and he should have stopped. He should have stopped much earlier. That he was changing his mind toward the end, but that's because he saw Germany losing. He didn't want to sink with the ship. So let's stop doing that. They were bad, and now we see history repeating itself. So if we can't even acknowledge that was bad, then how are we going to sort out what's going on right now?
Yeah. Getting back to Baerbock, I'm confident that she has no idea what she's saying. She's the type of person that sits in the room, listens to what everyone else is saying, and then she gets out to the media and she just repeats it. She has no idea what she's saying. So I'm sure she was sitting in at some brunch or something, some cocktail party that these foreign ministers are having in Brussels, or wherever this meeting is taking place. And a couple of them were probably saying, I read in CNN that Russia is losing 3,000 tanks a day, and that Putin is hiding in a bunker. We're going to stretch the EU all the way from Lisbon to Lugansk. And I'm sure Baerbock was listening in. She was like, Lisbon to Lugansk. Okay, yeah. Then she gets to the media and she repeats, just like she did with the whole Xi Jinping is a dictator when she was on Fox News. She listens to stuff. She has no idea of the context. She has no idea of the history. She has no idea what's going on the ground. And then she gets in front of the media and she just repeats it. That's it. I mean, she's this trifecta that is ruling Germany today: Olaf Scholz, Baerbock, and Habeck. These people are destroying Germany. I mean, they are demolishing Germany. The slower this war goes, the quicker Germany, the United States, the entire collective West collapses. That is the formula here. The slower Russia goes in this conflict, the quicker we see all of them collapsing, starting with Germany, because Germany is not only collapsing because of these three knuckleheads. They're collapsing because the U.S. is also going after Germany. Germany hasn't figured it out yet. They haven't figured out while they're antagonizing Russia and they're escalating with Russia, the U.S. is waging war on them. They still haven't put the pieces together. I'm convinced Olaf Scholz, Baerbock, maybe Habeck has. I don't know, Alexander Brian, what do you think? Habeck he strikes me as the more intelligent of the three.
Of the two, yes.
He's not the brightest one of them, but yeah.
Of the two, yes. I'm not going to waste time trying to work out what Habeck understands and doesn't understand. The fact is, he's now so committed to what he's been doing that he can't really turn back. And I don't get the sense that he has any desire to.
I would say there's a fundamental, sorry, just one last thought, since we're talking about European leaders, American leadership. You listen to them talking publicly. You listen to them at these think tanks where they're kind of in a more private space where they don't think most of the public will hear. And I think they would be more candid about the things that they're saying. They really don't seem to have a grasp on the details of how the real world works. A lot of these politicians never had a real job in the real world. They don't understand where things like where their food comes from, how energy is produced. Apparently, they don't understand how factories are built or operated, the problems with supply chains, so many things. And the few things that they are experts in may be things like financing, where they're playing with ledger sheets, but this is not something that always translates into tangible realities. And these people are running the West into the ground, and they are the ones who have the full control. Nobody else is allowed near the controls. And that is the main problem. And we can see at every step they are making the absolute worst decisions. And these are decisions you would expect someone that you just talk to casually in your daily life who has no grip on anything going on. They don't care. And they'll just say something because there's no consequence for them. They're an ordinary person. They're ill-informed. They don't know how things work. Doesn't matter. But these people are actually making decisions that do end up impacting the fate of their countries and their region.
And you know how many of their decisions are based on the media that they read, the CNN and the New York Times. I mean, Cyprus is small, Greece is small, so I've had some conversations with politicians, not top, but close enough to the top, and they believe everything they're reading in CNN and the New York Times. I mean, they really do believe it. They're not pretending. When you talk to them, they're not pretending. They're not. This is not theatrics. They really believe that when CNN tells them that Russia is losing, they believe Russia is losing. When they say that the Russian economy is in tatters, they believe it. I mean, they really do internalize it, and they believe it, and they base their policy on this, or they base the advising of, say, the prime minister or the president on these articles that they're getting from the collective West media. But the problem we all have is this. We know that CNN and the New York Times, they're reporting nonsense. We know, the people that are watching you right now, Danny, they know. You see, if you were to go to one of these government officials and you were to approach them and to say, the new Atlas, they're saying that what's happening on the front lines is not really, Russia's not really losing. They're not being rolled back. It's actually Russia that's making the advances over the 4-month counteroffensive. These government officials, they're reading CNN, and you know what they're going to say? They're going to say, even if I believe the new Atlas, there's no way that I'm going to go to to Prime Minister, to Chancellor Olaf, and tell him, you know what, Chancellor Olaf, we should probably, listen to what this Brian guy is saying at the New Atlas. There's no way they're gonna say that, because it's a risk. In sales, you always have that saying, you never got fired for choosing IBM. When you're purchasing software, back in the day when IBM was the big guy in software, they would choose the software, and yeah, there could be an upstart that had better software, had better tech, was better at everything. But the people that are making the purchasing, they say, these guys are better, but what if something goes wrong? Then they're going to fire me because I chose company X. But if I choose IBM, it could go wrong, it could break. But what are people going to tell me? Not my fault. I went with IBM. That's the thinking in Europe. And I'm positive that's the thinking in the United States. Even if this war goes completely wrong, all the advisors, all the think tanks, everyone in and around the Olaf Scholz's and the Mark Rutte's and all these people, they're going to say, but they were telling us that Russia was losing. They were telling us that Iraq had WMDs. The New York Times, they reported Iraq had WMDs. It's not my fault. It's not my fault that we went along with the United States to bomb Iraq. The New York Times was reporting this. This is the problem that we have in Europe and the United States.
Yes, and when we think about the things that these people are willing to say, and when you make those connections, Alex, and of course all of you have made some form of this point, is that it profoundly influences their actions. And that's why it's always interesting and also really important to read how the mainstream media, which is funneling messages from particular kinds of people, intelligence, think tanks, they are funneling particular messages, which then help inform the political class in terms of what kind of decisions they should be making. And that's why this revisionism, this World War II revisionism, these wild statements by Baerbock, they do have significance in terms of regardless of ignorance or whether they truly believe these things or have some sort of ulterior political motive. The actions speak for themselves in terms of how they then conduct policy. But I'm wondering if you all could entertain me just for a little longer on one last topic, and that is the when Alexander, you said that Russia is getting the message that they are not Europe. Well, there are, I think, in terms of Russia, there's some debate. I even saw an op-ed in RT of all places, which argued that Russia will eventually re-embrace the EU and the United States on all of this. I didn't find that argument to be very convincing. But I think on the other side, there's a lot of momentum. Russia's trade with Africa is exploding. I think somewhere between 40-45%. And the first 6 to 9 months of 2023. Putin, Lavrov have made very strong statements about their solidarity with Latin America. And then you also have China, too. Belt and Road Forum coming up. Putin is going to this, and the date has not been announced. I think in a lot of reasons for Putin's security and, all of this ICC business. Although China's not a party to that, there's still a lot of threats to Putin being made all the time. But I want to talk about this overall trend of multipolarity being it seems to me while it's not rejecting Europe or the European project or the Euro-American project, so to speak, there have been a lot of moves to move independently of it. And now you have the China-Syria strategic partnership, which was just established during Bashar al-Assad's visit in late August. So, in late September. So maybe just your thoughts about these developments. You have also India coming under increasing heat, I think, from Canada. Of course, the United States is kind of hedging its bets, but also pushing in a direction too of pressuring India to perhaps abandon BRICS or move away from BRICS. So there's a lot going on in this arena of multipolarity, and I'm wondering your thoughts about it.
Well, briefly, with respect to Russia, I think it is very important to understand that the Russians didn't turn their backs on Europe, at least not in their own conception. Europe and the West turned their backs on them. They didn't want them in Europe. They didn't want them in the West. At the best, they saw Russia purely as a place where they could extract raw materials and benefit from it in that kind of a way, but very much the Wild East that they didn't really want to bring into Europe, into the West, into the garden that Josep Borrell and Robert Kagan and people like that talk about. And I think what has happened is that the moment of real revelation of this came over the period of Putin's presidency, because Putin, when he first became president, was somebody who was very committed to integrating Russia into the EU and the West. If you look at his early speeches and early commentaries, the people he made his friendships with, wasn't with Xi Jinping's, wasn't with, Hu Jintao or someone like that. It was with people like the German Chancellor at that time, Schröder. It was with Jacques Chirac. It was with Berlusconi. He was courting people in Europe. And that was very much the attitude and the opinion amongst most Russians, and certainly amongst most elite Russians. What has happened, and the Ukrainian crisis has catalyzed this, is that gradually they became more and more disillusioned. And then over the Ukrainian crisis, and especially over the last 2 years, they finally said, look, this isn't working. It is never going to work. They don't like us. We're going to have the door slammed in our faces every time. This has been the story of Russian-European relations going back all the way to Peter the Great. I mean, when he came to Europe, they treated him as a savage, basically. And if you read accounts of Peter's famous embassy from the perspective of Western observers, that is pretty much as how they saw him. So the Russians are saying to themselves, enough's enough. Let's start engaging with other countries. And what they've discovered is that they're treated in a completely different way. And also, and this is, I think, the great revelation that the Russians now have, they've discovered that those other countries, China, the Koreas, South and North, especially South, because they've had very good relations with the South, Vietnam, they are actually as developed, as advanced technologically, industrially, far more so than the Europeans are. They have far more to offer. Not only are the Russians welcome there, but it's no longer a case that forging a relationship with China is like forging a relationship with a country that the Russians have been incessantly told is backward and primitive or something of this kind. And I think this has been, for the Russians at least, a liberating experience. And I don't think this is something that in the West people fully understand, that they find for the first time that they're dealing with people who respect them and like them and remember a lot of what the Soviet Union did, which was positive during the Cold War, in India, in Africa, in Latin America, in those sort of places. But also countries that have everything that Russia needs and more, to an even greater extent than the old countries in Europe did. So this has been a liberating moment, and it's not, the Russians are not going back on this. Now, as for the rest, well, China, of course, is developing. India, in a completely different way, is also developing. Countries like Vietnam, like other places around the world, Africa appears to be coming together. Latin America is now starting to assert itself in ways that it never did. And by the way, the Russians are now working to agree visa-free travel for Latin Americans to Russia, which is quite a big thing. Anyway, this is inevitable. This is history. We cannot imagine the idea that the world will be a world forever dominated by a small group of countries gathered on each side of the North Atlantic is profoundly anti-historical. It is simply wrong. And this is ultimately what multipolarity is. And the great tragedy and the great disaster is that the European countries and the Americans, very accustomed to this period of about 300, 400, 500 years of Western dominance, which is a short period in terms of human history, find it very, very difficult to accept this and are trying to push back on it and are using the still very considerable power that they actually have to try to prevent it happening and to turn it back. And that is both dangerous and it is misguided. It will either fail completely or it will result in a catastrophe, a human catastrophe, which one doesn't want to imagine.
I think that is very well said. I agree with all of that. The comment about how liberating this is for Russia, I think that is spot on. And it's very important for people to understand that the West has this concept that they are so superior because when they go around the world, unfortunately, so many times the ruling circles in these countries do look up to the West. I know that's the case in Southeast Asia, although it's changing. This is changing and it is liberating. I think it's liberating for all of these countries to realize the West, there is nothing fundamentally special about the West. They have accumulated all of this power and wealth, and that is why they're standing above everyone else. But as other nations begin developing technology, developing their economies and their military, we see that even greater things are possible because there's just so many more people in these other countries, India, China, Eurasia in general. And then I think we will see the same come out of Africa and South and Central America. So that's one really important thing to keep in mind. The other important thing to keep in mind is that these circles of power in the West, they see themselves as superior. They see everyone else as inferior. They do not see them as partners. They pretend that they do when they go to visit them, although this is very thinly veiled sometimes. President Joe Biden in Vietnam talking about what did he call it? Did he call it the third world? I think he might have called it the third world. So very thinly veiled act that they see these other nations as equal partners. They do not. They see them as inferior. They see them as nations that should be subjugated beneath them. Or Alexander, as you were talking about India in a recent video with Alex, in America's orbit. India should be in America's orbit. So this is unacceptable. Everyone should find this unacceptable. And I think the promise of multipolarism is to create a system where nations are dealing with each other as equal partners, and this master and subordinate, this formula that the West for generations has applied, this no longer applies.
The garden in the jungle. That's what I'm seeing in the chat. The garden in the jungle. And didn't what did Sarah Ashton Cirillo say when she was getting punked by Vovan and Lexis? She said that the Russians, like justifying her going after journalists and going after Russians, she said the Russians are not European. They're descendants of Mongols, or they're Asians. She said something like that. I know I'm messing up.
Asians.
Yeah, she said they're descendants of Mongols and they're Asians. Yeah, she said something like that. But that reveals what she's listening to. She's getting these talking points from someone, from some people. And so this is how they see things. And to put it simply, the collective West, they really messed up because all the countries that they've sanctioned, all the countries that they've disrespected, colonized, or pillaged from, they're all coming together now. This is going to be a problem for the collective West.
Well, if I could just read off. Oh, sorry, Brian.
Well,
Jump
I
in.
was just going to say, I think the biggest concern in the West regarding China's rise, other than their hegemony evaporating, is the comeuppance that they have coming to them. They're just worried, what if China does to us what we've done to them for so long? They're not really looking forward to finding out.
Well, I wanted to read the statement that you were referencing, Alex, from Sarah Ashton Cirillo. I think she's been deposed, right? She's been.
Yeah, I don't know. What
Yeah,
the
fine.
situation is.
Maybe she's back or already.
Whatever she was, it was very strange. Spokesperson for the armed forces. But she said Russians are not Europeans. Russians are Asian. Ultimately, they do come from the Mongols. So, Alex, you were correct. She did mention the Mongols. They do come from a grouping of people who want to be slaves and want to be led, just as it was from the days of Genghis Khan. I wish the rest of Europe and the Western world understood that Europe ends at Ukraine. We're protecting European values and Western values the same way those did hundreds and thousands of years ago when Mongols came in. So pretty picture perfect image of what people like this are thinking. But perhaps last on this note, the Syria-China strategic partnership, if you just give your comments on this, because it comes as China is being said to be collapsing economically. It comes after Biden's Asia tour was a huge flop. And it also comes as now the neocons are talking about China in relation to Ukraine. But this, the Middle East, the Arab world, the nations within West Asia, there's been a lot of moves of late. This comes in the context of a whole lot of developments there, some current and some just in recent history. So whoever would like to maybe conclude, we can conclude on this note.
Briefly, this is a big thing. Assad going to China is a very, very big thing because China is, of course, the other big pole of power at the moment, and it is the rising pole. All this talk about China on the verge of collapse, its economy being in pieces. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but let's suffice to say that they're in a much better shape than we are in the West. And anybody who lives in the West, anybody who lives in Britain at the moment will know exactly what I'm talking about. But anyway, so he's gone to China, and we did a program about this, Alex and I. The point is, it's the first visit he's done where he looks relaxed since the war began. He's brought his wife with him. He's never done that recently. So he's brought his wife with him. They've gone to China. They look relaxed. They look actually happy. It's not tense negotiations and all of this. And that in itself is a big indicator, not just to Assad personally, but to people in Syria, that the worst is now definitely behind us. We're normalizing. And of course, China has the means to normalize the situation in Syria. Now, the Chinese waited, I think, to give this invitation. They wanted, first of all, the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because China has good relations with Saudi Arabia. So they didn't want to cause problems with that relationship. And they wanted Syria also to rejoin the Arab League, which of course it has now done. So they wanted to receive this leader of the Arab world, who is now in good standing. They received him in a most interesting way. So Xi Jinping says that, he praised Assad's steadfastness and his ability to defend his strength in defending his country. Well, we all know against whom. And of course, it's part of the general Chinese policy of pulling together, taking the various bits of the Middle East, which have been shattered in this kind of way for so long, and starting to put all these various pieces together and to integrate them into this Chinese-led Eurasian system, which the Chinese are so keen to set up. So Syria obviously wants to be part of that. It will help Syria finally to normalize. And of course, for China, it enables China to start to rebuild its positions across the Middle East. China had very strong historic positions in the Middle East. That was where the Silk Road used to run through. People often forget about these things, but in China, they tend not to. And of course, it provides China potentially with access to the land access if they ever wanted to the Mediterranean.
I think that's, I agree with all of that. I think Alexander laid out the steps that China went through in order for this to happen. And it just illustrates the amount of patience and geostrategic thinking that is taking place in Beijing versus the knee-jerk reactions happening in Washington, London, and Brussels. And as Alexander said, China has the means to normalize things with Syria. They have the means to rebuild Syria. Syria needs to be rebuilt. They also need to be connected to a region that is no longer at constant war. Again, provoked by the United States and its allies, deliberately so, to prevent stability, to prevent the region from coming together and moving out from under the shadow of Western hegemony that has been cast over it since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And so we are watching this take place. This is another stepping stone in a very long process that is not going to happen overnight. I think all of us who have been following geopolitics for a long time, when we heard about BRICS, a lot of people a long time ago used to think that this was going to happen very quickly. It wasn't, but it is happening. And as a matter of fact, I would say back then I thought this would take 20, 30, 40 years to unfold, but it's happening much faster than I thought that it would, especially now. And the irony here is that it's mostly things the West is doing that is creating the catalyst for this to accelerate. I think that is very interesting. I think that's something we have to keep a close eye on.
Yeah, I don't have anything further to add. If there's one country that could solve what the problems that Syria has, it's China. So,
yeah, no, it's we'll definitely have to keep a lookout on all of this. I mean, yeah, as all you said, it's huge. All of these things are huge. They're making China, Russia, making huge inroads in this larger project of a multipolar world. And Brian, as you said, the West has a huge part to play in why this is all occurring, because unlike the Cold War, even if we are in a Cold War 2.0 right now, the range of politics and the range of the ways in which each of these individual countries go about things is quite different. What's uniting all of them and what's growing BRICS, what's growing a lot of these institutions is pressure from the West itself, and the way that the West is really kind of committing a self-destruction as it seeks to maintain hegemony. But I've kept you all a very long time.
I just really one last thing. I just wanted to throw this in. The approach China is taking to the Middle East, because we've always heard about peace in the Middle East. We saw the United States pretending to attempt to broker this peace. And it was always done in a very superficial, disingenuous way. They always said, oh, the Palestinians and the Israelis, they've been fighting since the Bible. It's hopeless. It can't be done. And the peace efforts were always empty, meaningless. And then you see China come in. They begin addressing the socioeconomic and geopolitical fundamentals that were driving this. And most importantly, the West's influence over the region. That was the primary cause for this. And by creating alternatives for these nations to pivot away from this toxic relationship with the United States, this is what's finally allowing peace to begin flourishing in the region. It's very important for people to see through the ideology, the religion, the belief that this is all driven by those things, and see the actual fundamentals that matter and how China is changing those fundamentals to actually create tangible changes and improvement in the region.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, and I said this yesterday with Richard Medhurst on my program. I said if China starts to build infrastructure in Syria with its, let's say, a lot of times it's state-owned companies, will Israel feel like it can just bomb Damascus in the same way if a lot of that infrastructure will it feel compelling? It will change things. And I think all of this, BRICS, Saudi Arabia joining, UAE joining BRICS, these things, they do change things. We saw the normalization with Iran and Saudi Arabia in Beijing. I mean, that already has changed a lot of the way that diplomacy and conflict is conducted there. So it's really interesting to see, and we'll have to keep an eye out on it. But I have kept you guys very long. I really appreciate you taking the time today. You all can give where they can find you. I did tag your channels in the video title, so people can definitely go there. But maybe any final goodbyes, anything you want to say before you leave, promotions, things like that.
Just to say, an amazing program and a great honor to be on it.
Likewise. Always a pleasure to be on your channel, Danny, and always a pleasure to share the screen with Alex and Alexander.
Great to be on. Thank you, Danny, for having this roundtable. It's been great.
Of course. And so of course, the things heat up, we'll have to be in touch soon. But take care, everyone. Have good evenings. Have a good morning, Brian. Good sleep. Bye. Bye-bye. All right. So that was a great talk. Just a few quick announcements before I head out myself. Wednesday, I'm going to be back live again for a second roundtable. I'm doing some of these roundtables before I head out to Vietnam, actually. I will be there for 17 days or so. I mean, that includes travel, so my time there will probably be around 2 weeks. But with that said, I'm doing a roundtable on Wednesday, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. Stay tuned for that. Be sure you're subscribed, hit that notifications bell so you know. I will be on with Scott Ritter, Andrei Martyanov, the author, a geopolitical analyst, and Garland Nixon. So all three of those will be joining me too for what should be a spirited and fun conversation on the latest developments worldwide. So be sure you save that date, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time, right here on this channel. With that said, everyone, I will be heading out. Before I do, I'm going to give some shout outs and some also plugs. So please do, as I begin to travel more, make things happen so I can give you all coverage from outside of my bubble here in this office space. Please do support this work. The best way to do it is on Patreon at patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. They're annual memberships. You can suggest guests, content, ask questions. You can get a free copy of my book, my 2019 co-authored book, up there, as you see above my head, on American exceptionalism. And of course, you can get audio of my work. And of course, the sirens are going off here as per usual, in order to show how urgent it is to support independent media. So please do that. Substack is also a great option. Buy me a coffee for one-time support. PayPal as well, one-time support. All of those go a long way to helping keep this work alive and help keep the lights on and keep me I'm up making upgrades to technology and all the good stuff to keep this channel growing, cover labor costs, etc. Lastly, I do want to point out my Rumble channel. So I am on Rumble now. Welcome, Rumble community. So please do follow me on Rumble. I can actually just send the channel in the chat. I'm going to try to do this periodically to grow the Rumble channel. So please do follow me on Rumble. Rockfin family, hello. Thank you all for joining there. Also, you can follow me on Rockfin. Just type in my name, Danny Haiphong. And of course, there are other ways to follow my work. Go to my link tree. Follow me on Telegram, t.me/Danny Haiphong. That's a great way to support me independently, get notifications, and it's a free option too. With that, all that said, everyone, I want to shout out all the Patreon subscribers who are viewing today. Thank you so much for your generosity. I want to shout out Substack paid members. Thank you so much as well. Of course, everyone who gives one-time donations through PayPal, Buy Me a Coffee, and otherwise, Rockfin tips, all appreciated. Of course, everyone who views this program hits that like button, subscribe button. You all are very much appreciated as well. And I'm just going to put up some of the super chats to give you all shout outs. We have Hugo Chavez. Thank you, Hugo Chavez, back from the dead. The Royal Navy will be replacing Admiral Ratikin with Alexander Maciras. Thank you so much for that super chat. Question from Sparky. I didn't get to ask questions today. I kept them quite long, but I appreciate the super chat. Why should Russians advance forward as long as the Ukrainian military continues to feed itself into the Russian meat grinder? That's a good point. Hugo Chavez again, thank you. Ukraine is in the Volkstrom phase. It's over. Thank you. Andrew Howard says love to Maciras. Z, thank you so much. Sparky said tragedy. It's a real life horror movie. It is. I mean, you could certainly say a horror movie could be made very quickly off of this conflict. We have Michael Seymour. Thank you so much. According to Lindsey Graham, Romney, and Crystal, it is good to invest money for 400,000 dead Ukrainians if we weaken Russia without losing soldiers. Yeah, that was the Libya model. Forget CERT. Forget all those people who died, right? How many people died in Libya? Hundreds of thousands, either prematurely through the military intervention or through what happened to the Libyan people. So yes, this is the model of war that the United States would prefer to fight. But interestingly enough, they're not doing it right in Ukraine, according to a lot of sources now. A very interesting pivots, so to speak. So thank you so much for that. Sparky said, you missed World War II. Didn't Russia win World War II? That it did. And the Soviet Union actually fought on the side of the Allies. People tend to forget that. And really, you could say it was the Allies that had to join the bandwagon finally after waiting for quite a while to really fight. So thank you for that comment. Ralph, thank you so much for the commentless super chat. Here we have Hugo Chavez. Are any of you guys scared of Sarah Asher Cirillo will make good on, let's say, I'm not going to do his threats, her threats. You know, I know that Sarah considers themselves trans or whatever. So let's just keep it. Let's not focus and emphasize that. Maybe that was an honest error, but you know, I think it's safe to say that regardless of whatever we think about gender and transgender politics, I take more of a side of let people be. Let's focus on the real issues at hand, including on that issue, and also let's focus on the weaponization of these issues to promote wars. And also let's understand that just because corporations and militarists and fascists and neocons put a pride flag or talk good about trans people, it doesn't mean that they're advocating for anybody's rights, let alone theirs. Look at what Blinken said about Babin Yar. Let's not forget that the NAZIs were, let's just say, not so kind to people who practice any kind of sexuality outside of what they consider the Aryan norm, so to speak. So let's not forget that when Blinken says these things, he's actually promoting some of the most heinous and really actually fascistic kind of narratives. So here we have Sparky, make Ukraine Russia again. Don't leave a patch called Ukraine lest it become BlackRock property. Or yes, I remember you saying this on my last stream. Thank you so much. Good point. Also very complex struggle, but appreciate your enthusiasm. Robin R, thank you so much. Ellen, thank you so much for becoming a new member. Really appreciate your membership. Violin had a question about kidnapping of Julian Assange or retaliation for the arrest of Pinochet by Garzin under universal jurisdiction. Can't only make it a $10 question. It deserves so much more, as do you all. Sorry we didn't get to this one. That's a very complex question. That is why I don't necessarily have the answer to. I do think Julian Assange is a retaliation for many things, many, many, many things. The persecution of Julian Assange, yeah, sure, you could say it is partly of that, but also I would say it's a retaliation just in general to anyone who speaks out against the war machine. So thank you so much, Peter, for your super sticker. Sherry, thanks for being a member and for your generous super chat. Sparky said Mark Sloboda indicated on Brian's show the other day that Zelensky's mom isn't Jewish. That means he's not Jewish. Why is the mainstream media allowed to continue calling him Jewish to shield Ukrainian NAZIs? Well, I think it all is all about of giving him the identity of being a Democrat, whether he's Jewish or not. I'm not gonna, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert at what it means to be Jewish, although my wife is, but she's more secular, more, let's just say, of the Jewish variety, of the old communist Jews of yesteryear, and I don't really know the norms and standards or whatever it means to be Jewish, but nonetheless, the way he has treated Ukraine, the way he has gone along with the neocons and promoted and backed and armed and integrated these forces that we know are very, let's just say, anti-Jewish, to be very nice about it, for the YouTube demonetizers, I think it's safe to say that it doesn't really matter how he identifies. His actions speak for themselves. David says, finally, the beginning of the end of 500 years of Western capitalist crime, slavery, theft of land, South America, Canada, Australia, theft of resources. Yeah, it's true. We're seeing the end of this order. This unipolar imperial order is crumbling, and the global South is indeed on the rise, and they have very powerful leadership now with Russia and China. It is the end of that. It is. It's just a matter of when, not if. Veso Yankov, thank you so much for this. W. Lim, thank you so much as well. Hugo Chavez again. Alexander, spot on about Blinken. He can only speak in cliches and sound bites. He LARPs as a statesman. He shouldn't. Interesting. Sparky again, because of the direct lineage to World War II, people should know that Ukrainians are actually NAZIs and not NAZIs. Well, yes, some. I wouldn't say all, because I think, I guess we can go back and forth about what it means to be Ukrainian, what it means to not be, given Ukraine was an outgrowth. It has a long history, complicated, predate, but at the same time, it's been part of Russia historically. I believe, what's his name? The former Soviet leader, Khrushchev, was Ukrainian. There's a complicated history there. At the same time, we have to understand, yes, that the current forces, I would say, that would openly identify as NAZIs and be sympathetic for them, or neo-NAZIs, are indeed just NAZIs. I think that's a good point. Sparky, the Allies consider Romo one of the better Germans since he wasn't all hooray. Okay, yeah, we can quibble. Fighting on that side, though, I don't know. I get it. Could have been important at that time. Maybe not so important historically now. Neurosurgery Highland says, if WF partners collapse the economy with an event in Ukraine, everyone in the West will take whatever their governments will enforce. CBDC and capital and traveling restrictions. Okay. All right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's bigger than the World Economic Forum. I don't subscribe to the line the World Economic Forum is simply the biggest enemy, biggest of them all. I think that the forces of capital are much bigger, have bigger fish to fry than just the WEF, which is literally a forum, and honestly doesn't do that much. I mean, I know others talk about Bilderberg and these kind of secret societies and things like that. I think that capital actually works in nefarious ways, both secretly and out in the open. That doesn't require. I mean, we can look at that as nefarious and secretive, and we should. And at the same time, we should look at capital as being the neoliberal capital, their handlers, all of them, the ruling elite. They get things done in both closed doors ways and very much out in the open, and it doesn't really matter because the result is the same. How is the NAZification going for real? Says Queen Red Special. Well, look at the conflict. Russia is indeed moving forward. At the same time, though, to eliminate those kind of forces in totality would mean the end of Ukraine, because let's just say that while not every Ukrainian identifies as this, in order to really shift power in Ukraine, you'd have to disempower them fully. So Mr. H had industrial policy, diversified industry, a real army. He lost to Russia anyway. Banderite swastikas won't okay. Thank you so much. Sparky says, Mark Felton's video of Ukrainian girl burned gate traffic. She said she was okay. Well, appreciate this. Appreciate you again, Hugo Chavez. Broke Lisbon to Lugansk, woke Vladivostok to Berlin. bespoke Kuril Islands to British Islands. All right, we got some. Okay, so thank you so much generosity today for the channel. Sparky again, many super chats. Thank you. We have Marcel David. Thank you. Yoev Bresler. Thank you. Rich 4. Thank you again, Sparky. I'm not going to pull you up again, Sparky. I've given you a lot of shout outs here. So Tabernac, thank you. Brixton, thank you. Jorge Ruiz, Darren the Dhaiphong Masterclass in Geopolitics. Thank you so much, Jorge. Entry says, Alex Christopher, I'm curious. It disturbs me that the UK maybe consider putting military advisors, boots on the ground. Your thoughts? So they did give thoughts on this, thankfully, but sorry to not have gotten that question earlier. And then Brixton says, Alexander M. Democracy is destiny. Ukraine's demographics are abysmal. Jamestown Foundation. Look up Ukraine's population pyramid. Young people Ben Wallace wants to recruit simply do not exist. They've died. It's really, I mean, it's disgusting. They're gone. They're either gone, displaced, hiding, traumatized, exactly as Alexander McCure said. It is absolutely abhorrent. It is horrid. It is horrific what has gone on in Ukraine. And to blame Russia for that, to blame Russia for this, when all Russia has been saying all along is let's listen to the will of the people of Lugansk, Donetsk, and the entire Donbass. This is a will that has been exerted and expressed since 2014, of course, earlier, but the watershed moment was 2014 when Ukraine was couped and then pushed and prodded into waging this conflict inside of the Russian-speaking territories. I mean, it was so simple, right? To just let these republics have sovereignty, self-determination, autonomy to some degree. We would not have the conflict we do now if that were allowed to happen. Of course, Minsk was a joke, and now even just these intimations of ceasefire, a complete joke, because how can you ever trust the collective West again after what happened to Minsk, after all that's happened in Ukraine during the conflict, after Nord Stream? I mean, on and on and on. There's no trust to be had with the collective West. So it is indeed, it is one of these things that goes to show that these warmongers, they're going to continue going. They're going to keep going, and we're going to have to keep going, pushing back on them. But with all that said, everyone, I should get out of here. I have an appointment in about 45 minutes, and I have to get ready for it. I have to also get to work. So with all of that said, before you leave, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit that notifications bell here on YouTube. Join my Rumble channel. Look up my name on Rumble. Rockfin, same deal. Join those channels. It's how you fight censorship. Also, please do consider supporting me monetarily if you can. I want to appreciate all the super chats again, especially those who have been incredibly generous today. But of course, Patreon is the best place. You can find that link in the video description. Annual memberships are very well possible and, of course, appreciated. I'm going to Vietnam soon, so you're going to see a huge push for content in terms of live streams up until then. I'm also going to pre-publish a lot of old archive videos. Unfortunately, they'll be a little old, but nonetheless, the content will be hearty. And hopefully you'll get a lot out of it. As I go to Vietnam, I'll travel to 3 different cities with Veterans for Peace. I'll do some geopolitical work out there, either individually or with another person. I have some people I do hope to meet out there with a focus not just on the history of the war, not just on what people are doing to rectify the situation, what we can learn from that in relation to what's going on in Ukraine, because I do believe the debt that the United States especially has to the world is grand, and in no place is that more stark than Vietnam. But at the same time, I will also want to talk to people. Hopefully I'll get a few who I can talk to about in the delegation, as well as maybe Vietnamese themselves, who can talk about this conflict, Ukraine, but also China and kind of current day relations, multipolarity, etc., because it is good to get that different perspective. And it's very complex, especially after Biden's Asia visit, which included and most highlighted was his Vietnam visit. So it should be a great trip. I'll be gone from October 12th to the 29th. I don't get back till the 30th. I don't even get there. The 14th to the 29th is really the trip. A couple days traveling the 12th, and then a day traveling back on the 29th. I'll be back the 30th, and then really kicking off in November. To be honest, it's going to be returning back in November for content, okay? So, or at least original content. So that's the big announcements. Of course, you know where to find me. It was a great stream with Alexander Mercouris, Alex Christoforou, and Brian Berletic. Of course, I just want to thank them again for them spending their time out with me today on this Monday, October 2nd. I hope to see you all October 4th with Scott Ritter, Andrei Martyanov, and Garland Nixon as we do another roundtable. October 4th, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And I will see you all again, hopefully then. It should be a good one. Take good care, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you so much for all your support, and I will be back again Wednesday. Bye-bye.